She was 8 months pregnant, and he left her. Ava Sinclair thought she had it all. A home, a husband, a future. But in one cruel moment, Logan, the man she trusted most, abandoned her at a gas station in the middle of nowhere. Alone, helpless, betrayed. But Ava didn't break. She rose. With a stranger's unexpected kindness and a strength she never knew she had, she rebuilt her life, while the man who left her lost everything. How did she do it? And what happened when Logan came crawling back? Watch till the end to find out. Where are you watching from? Comment below, subscribe for more powerful stories. The night was heavy with rain, the kind that blurred headlights and made the world feel smaller, lonelier. The sleek, black sports car sliced through the empty highway, its tires humming against the wet asphalt. Inside, Ava Sinclair sat in the passenger seat, one hand resting on her swollen belly, the other gripping the armrest tightly. She was exhausted, her body aching from the long drive. But the discomfort wasn't just physical. Something felt off. Logan Sinclair, her husband, hadn't said a word in nearly 2 hours. His sharp, chiseled features remained unreadable, his fingers drumming an impatient rhythm against the steering wheel. Ava had tried to ignore the growing unease creeping up her spine, but with every passing mile, it became harder. The silence between them was suffocating. Finally, she cleared her throat, her voice careful. "Logan, can we stop for a minute? I need to use the restroom." He exhaled sharply through his nose, gripping the wheel tighter. "Can't it wait?" She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, feeling the familiar pressure against her bladder. "I've been holding it for almost an hour. Please, Logan." Without another word, he jerked the car toward the next exit, the sudden motion making her stomach lurch. The car pulled into a small, dimly lit gas station off the highway, the neon sign flickering weakly above the closed convenience store. The place looked abandoned, the only light coming from a single buzzing street lamp near the restroom entrance. Ava exhaled in relief as Logan eased the car to a stop. "I'll be quick," she promised, reaching for the door handle. He said nothing. For a moment, she hesitated. There was something in the way his jaw clenched, the way his knuckles whitened against the steering wheel. He looked like a man balancing on the edge of something dangerous, but she was too tired to question it. Instead, she forced a small smile and stepped out into the cool night air, the rain instantly chilling her skin. The gas station restroom was as uninviting as she had expected. Flickering fluorescent lights, cracked mirror, the faint smell of old bleach barely masking something worse. Ava washed her hands, staring at her reflection. Dark circles clung under her eyes, her face paler than usual. She ran a hand over her belly, whispering softly, "Just a little longer. Soon we'll be home." Home. The word felt foreign now, unstable. She dried her hands and stepped back outside, shivering against the cold. But as soon as she turned toward the parking lot, her breath hitched. The car was gone. For a moment, she simply stood there, frozen, her brain refusing to process what her eyes were telling her. She scanned the lot, expecting, hoping to see the familiar shape of the black car parked somewhere else. Maybe he had just moved it. Maybe this was some kind of cruel joke. But the gas station was empty. Ava's heart slammed against her ribs. She fumbled for her phone with trembling fingers, dialing Logan's number. It rang once, twice. Then her screen lit up with a single message. "We're done. Take care of yourself." The words didn't make sense. They couldn't be real. She stared at them, blinking, trying to force them into something logical. Her fingers tightened around the phone as she called again, straight to voicemail. No, 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 no. Her voice broke as the truth crashed over her. He had left her. He had abandoned her, 8 months pregnant, in the middle of nowhere. Her body began to shake, a mix of cold, shock, and something deeper. Something raw and gut-wrenching. The night felt darker, the rain colder, the silence around her stretching endlessly. She turned in a slow circle, scanning the highway. Nothing. No headlights, no movement. Then, as if the universe wanted to twist the knife deeper, another message appeared on her screen. This time, it wasn't from Logan. A photo. Ava's breath caught in her throat as her vision blurred. Logan sat at a luxury beach resort, lounging in a private cabana, a champagne flute in hand, and beside him, draped over his arm, was Madison. The woman she had suspected for months, the woman she had suspected for months, the woman she had suspected for months, the woman Logan had sworn was just a friend. They were laughing, carefree, celebrating her absence. Ava's knees buckled. The gas station lights above her buzzed faintly, the world around her spinning. She pressed a hand to her stomach, her baby, her heart pounding with the weight of betrayal. Logan hadn't just left. He had planned this. The cold seeped into her bones, the edges of her vision darkening as reality closed in. She had nothing. No money. No ID. No ID. No way home. And then the first contraction hit. Ava clutched her stomach as the sharp pain ripped through her abdomen, stealing the breath from her lungs. This couldn't be happening. Not now. Not here. She braced herself against the cold metal of the gas station street lamp, her nails digging into her palm as she tried to steady her breathing. The rain poured harder, drumming against the pavement, soaking through her coat, her dress, her skin. The world blurred around her, distorted by water and fear. No cars, no voices, no help. She fumbled for her phone again, her fingers trembling so violently that she almost dropped it. Her screen was smeared with raindrops, the battery flashing a cruel 5, a battery flashing a cruel 5 dimmed in the top corner. With a desperate gasp, she tried dialing 911, but the call failed before it could even connect. A sob broke from her lips. She was stranded. She was alone. Another contraction hit, harder than the first, sending her to her knees. She pressed her forehead against her damp sleeve, biting down on a cry. She had read about early contractions, had spent nights obsessing over every worst-case scenario, but never in her wildest fears had she imagined this. She forced herself to move, crawling toward the covered gas pumps, seeking any form of shelter. Her breath came in short, ragged pants. She needed to think, needed to find a way out of this. But the pain was coming faster now, and the exhaustion's pulling at her like an anchor, threatening to drag her under. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the empty highway in a stark, blinding flash. And then, just as she thought she might collapse entirely, she saw them. Headlights. A car. She tried to push herself up, but her legs felt like dead weight. The vehicle slowed as it neared the station, its bright beams cutting through the sheets of rain. She could barely lift her arm to wave. Please see me. Please stop. The tires rolled to a halt, the engine cut off. Through the rain and the haze of pain, she saw a figure step out, holding an umbrella. A man. Tall, broad-shouldered, moved toward her with quick, purposeful strides. His voice was deep, steady, laced with concern. "Miss, are you okay?" Ava tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Another contraction tore through her, and her body gave up. She swayed, her vision going black at the edges. Strong arms caught her before she hit the ground. "I've got you," the man murmured. His voice was low, grounding, a tether in the storm. She felt herself being lifted, cradled against warmth, the steady pounding of his heartbeat in her ear. She wanted to fight against the unconsciousness pulling at her, but her body had reached its limit. As the darkness swallowed her whole, she heard him again, urgent but calm. "Stay with me." The last thing she felt was the rain washing over her and the warmth of safety pulling her in. Ava drifted in and out of consciousness, her mind a tangled blur of exhaustion and pain. There was movement, gentle but firm, the sensation of being carried, of warmth enveloping her despite the cold rain still soaking her clothes. A voice deep and steady wove through the haze. "Just hold on, you're safe." The words barely registered as her body surrendered to the overwhelming weight of fatigue. The next thing she knew, she was being laid down on something soft, the scent of leather and clean linen wrapping around her. A door slammed shut, an engine roared to life, and then they were moving. She tried to open her eyes, to ask where she was, who had found her, but her lips refused to form the words. The contractions had subsided for now, but her body ached in ways she had never known before. Every breath felt heavy, like she was breathing through water. Time stretched and twisted. She wasn't sure how long they drove, only that the sound of the rain against the car windows and the rhythmic hum of the tires against the road lulled her into a fragile state between sleep and wakefulness. Then, suddenly, light. Bright, fluorescent, sterile. The unmistakable scent of antiseptic filled her nose, jolting her back to reality. Her eyelids fluttered open, and she found herself staring at a white ceiling, the distant beeping of a heart monitor somewhere close by. A hospital. For a moment, panic surged through her. Her baby. She tried to sit up, but before she could push herself upright, a firm yet gentle hand pressed against her shoulder, urging her back down. "Easy," a voice said. "You're safe." Ava turned her head, her vision still adjusting. A man sat beside her hospital bed, dark-haired, kind-eyed, watching her carefully. He wasn't Logan. Not even close. He looked rugged but composed, his jaw shadowed with faint stubble, his expression unreadable yet steady. She swallowed, her throat dry. "Where?" "County Hospital," he answered, adjusting the blanket draped over her. "You passed out before I could get your name, but the doctors ran a check while you were unconscious." He hesitated, then said, "Ava Sinclair, right?" She blinked at him, still struggling to process.
Oh, how do you know that?
"The hospital checked your ID," he said, his voice even. Then, carefully, "You didn't have an emergency contact listed." Ava's stomach twisted. Of course she didn't. She had no one, no family, no friends she could call in the middle of the night. The only person she had relied on, the father of her child, had left her alone in a gas station parking lot like she was nothing. She turned away, staring at the ceiling. The sharp pain in her chest was almost worse than the contractions had been. The man, her rescuer, was quiet for a long moment before speaking again. "I'm Ethan," he said. "Ethan Calloway. I found you on the side of the road." Ava swallowed hard, gripping the thin hospital blanket between her fingers. A small, almost self-conscious smile tugged at the corner of his lips. You could say that." Silence stretched between them, heavy and uncertain. Ava forced herself to breathe, to focus, to push past the overwhelming flood of emotions trying to drown her. Then, Ethan leaned forward slightly, his expression shifting into something more serious. "Ah," he said carefully, "I need to ask you something." Her chest tightened. "What?" "The hospital couldn't reach anyone for you," he said, watching her reaction closely. "So I have to ask, where is your husband?" Ava felt like the air had been sucked from the room. The words cut deep, forcing her to relive the moment all over again. She could lie, say Logan was away on business, that he was on his way, that this was all a misunderstanding. But looking at Ethan, the man who had stopped for her in the rain, who had brought her here, who had made sure she was safe, she knew she couldn't. Her lips trembled, her throat burned. And when she finally spoke, the words tasted like poison. "He left me." Ethan didn't speak right away. His expression remained unreadable, but something flickered in his eyes. Something sharp, restrained. His jaw tightened, his fingers curling slightly where they rested on his knee. Ava braced herself for pity, for awkward apologies, for the kind of forced sympathy she had grown to despise. But it didn't come. Instead, Ethan exhaled slowly, running a hand through his dark hair. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quieter, steadier. "What do you mean?" "He left you." Ava swallowed against the lump rising in her throat. She turned her gaze to the hospital wall, unable to meet his eyes. Saying it out loud made it feel too real, too final. "We were on a road trip," she murmured, her voice hoarse. "He pulled into a gas station, told me to go inside, and then he just drove away." The silence that followed was suffocating. She could feel Ethan's stare, burning with unspoken thoughts. Finally, he let out a sharp breath, his voice edged with disbelief. "You're 8 months pregnant." Ava let out a humorless laugh, shaking her head. "Trust me, I know." Another pause. Then, softly but dangerously, Ethan muttered, "That bastard." The sheer disgust in his voice startled her. It wasn't pity. It wasn't hollow concern. It was anger. Real, unfiltered anger. Not for himself, but for her. Something tightened in Ava's chest, unfamiliar and unsettling. She had spent so long feeling invisible, so long convincing herself that no one would ever be on her side. And yet, here was this man, a stranger, furious on her behalf. She shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to do with that feeling. Before she could say anything, her phone buzzed on the small table beside the bed. The sound sent a jolt of nerves through her. No one ever called her, no one except... She grabbed it quickly, heart pounding. But it wasn't a call. It was a message. Her breath caught in her throat. The sender was an unknown number. And attached to the text was a photo. Ava's stomach twisted as she clicked on it. There he was, Logan, sitting comfortably in a private cabana at a luxury beach resort, a cocktail in hand. His arm draped lazily around a woman's shoulders. A woman Ava recognized instantly. Madison. Her hands trembled as she stared at the image. Logan looked happy, carefree. He wasn't grieving the loss of his wife. He wasn't regretting anything. He was celebrating. The air left her lungs. It felt like being hit all over again, like crashing headfirst into a truth she had been too afraid to fully accept. Logan hadn't just left her. He had planned this. He wanted her gone. Ava barely registered the phone slipping from her grasp, landing on the bed with a dull thud. Her pulse roared in her ears. The hospital room, the steady beeping of the monitor, Ethan's presence. Everything blurred into the background, Somewhere in the haze, she felt movement. Then Ethan's voice, low but firm. She forced herself to breathe, to blink back the stinging in her eyes. Slowly, she reached for the phone and turned the screen toward him. Ethan leaned in, his brows drawing together as he took in the image. The change in him was instant. His entire body tensed, his jaw locking. A muscle twitched in his temple, and when he spoke, his voice was controlled but barely. "That's your husband?" Ava gave a stiff nod. Ethan stared at the screen for another second, his grip tightening on the phone. Then, abruptly, he set it back down. He exhaled through his nose, rubbing a hand over his face like he was trying to contain the storm brewing inside him. Finally, he looked at her again, his gaze unwavering. "You don't have to tell me everything," he said, his voice softer now. "But I need you to know something." Ava swallowed hard, her throat raw. "What?" Ethan leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking onto hers. "You're not alone." Her breath hitched. She stared at him, searching for hesitation, for uncertainty. But there was none. Just quiet certainty, steady truth. For so long, she had believed that she was on her own, that no one would ever stand by her, that she had no choice but to survive alone. But this man, this stranger, who had pulled her from the storm, who had sat by her bedside, who had called Logan a bastard without a second thought, was telling her otherwise. Ava wasn't sure if she believed him yet, but for the first time in a long, long time, she wanted to. Ava didn't know how to respond. The words "you're not alone" hung between them, foreign and unfamiliar, like a language she had never learned to speak. For so long, she had been conditioned to believe the opposite. Logan had isolated her, convinced her that she had no one but him, and then, when it suited him, he had discarded her without hesitation. The idea that a stranger, Ethan, could say something so simple, yet so impossible, felt like a trick of the universe. She swallowed hard, shifting against the hospital bed. The IV in her arm tugged slightly, grounding her in reality. She wasn't at that gas station anymore. She wasn't at that gas station anymore. She wasn't standing alone in the rain, abandoned. She was here. She was alive. And she had a choice to make. Ethan didn't push. He sat back in his chair watching her carefully, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. It was a patient kind of silence, one that made it clear he wasn't expecting an answer, at least not right away. Ava licked her lips, her throat still raw. I don't know what to do," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded slowly, as if he had expected that. "You don't have to figure everything out right now," he said. "Just focus on resting. The rest can come later." She let out a shaky breath, pressing a hand to her belly. Her baby. That was the only thing that mattered now. Not Logan. Not Logan. Not the past. Just the life growing inside her. But how was she supposed to take care of a child when she had nothing? As if reading her mind, Ethan leaned forward. "Do you have somewhere to go?" Ava hesitated. I thought I did." That was the truth, wasn't it? She had believed that Logan was her home, that despite the cracks in their marriage, despite the nagging feeling in her gut that something was always just slightly off, he would never actually leave her. But now she knew better. She had nowhere. And Logan had made sure of that. Ethan studied her for a long moment before exhaling through his nose, as if making a decision. "You can stay with me." Ava's head snapped up, eyes wide. "What?" "Just until you figure things out," he clarified, his voice calm but firm. I have a spare room. You need rest. You need a safe place. And I can't, in good conscience, let you leave this hospital without one." Ava opened her mouth, then closed it again. She wasn't used to kindness that didn't come with strings attached. She shook her head. "I can't just—" "Ava." Her name and his voice made her pause. She looked at him and for the first time really saw him, not just as the man who had pulled her from the storm, but as someone who wasn't offering help out of obligation or pity. He wasn't Logan. He wasn't trying to control her or manipulate her. He was just Ethan. And he meant it. Her throat tightened. "Why would you do this?" His lips pressed together for a second, as if he was searching for the right words. "Because someone should have done it for you a long time ago." A lump formed in her throat. She turned away, blinking back the sting in her eyes. For the first time in forever, someone was choosing to stay. And she didn't know how to handle it. She could refuse. She could push him away, tell him she'd figure it out on her own. But she was tired. So tired. And deep down, she knew, if she walked away now, she wouldn't be walking toward anything. She would be running. Ava closed her eyes, inhaled shakily, then nodded. Just once. Ethan didn't gloat. He didn't say "I told you so" or act like he had won something. He just nodded back as if this was the most natural thing in the world. "Okay," he said simply. "Let's get you out of here." And just like that, for the first time in a long, long time, she wasn't alone. Ava never thought she would wake up in a place that didn't feel cold. For so long, home had been a mansion with walls too high, furniture too pristine to touch, and silence that stretched between her and Logan like an invisible canyon. Now, as she stirred awake, the warmth of a thick blanket wrapped around her, she realized. The warmth of a thick blanket wrapped around her, she realized. The scent of fresh coffee and something faintly cinnamon drifted in from the hallway. Soft morning light streamed through the window, casting golden patterns on the wooden floors. The room wasn't extravagant, but it was warm. Soft blankets, shelves filled with books, a chair in the corner with a folded sweater draped over the back. It wasn't just a place to sleep. It was lived in. Ava exhaled, pressing a hand to her belly. The baby shifted inside her, as if sensing the change, and for the first time in days, she didn't feel like she was drowning. She carefully sat up, wincing slightly at the stiffness in her body. She was still exhausted, but the overwhelming sense of panic from the hospital had faded into something else. Something quieter. She had made it through the night. And for now, that was enough. A gentle knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Before she could answer, the door cracked open just enough for Ethan to peek inside. "Morning," he said, his voice softer than she expected. "You awake?" Ava nodded, suddenly self-conscious. She had fallen asleep in borrowed clothes, the oversized shirt stretching over her belly. She felt small, like a guest in a life that wasn't hers. Ethan stepped inside, holding a mug in one hand. "I made tea," he said, glancing at her hesitance. "I figured coffee might not be the best idea right now." Ava blinked, surprised. Logan had never remembered things like that. She hesitated before taking the mug, the warmth sinking into her cold fingers. "Thanks," she murmured. Ethan didn't hover. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, as if giving her space to breathe. "How are you feeling?" She swallowed. The easy answer was fine. The automatic response she had given so many times before. But it wasn't true. She looked down at the tea, watching the steam swirl in lazy circles. "I don't know," she admitted. Ethan didn't push. He just nodded, like that was an acceptable answer. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, though. It was steady, like the quiet before the ocean pulls back into a wave. Then Ethan shifted. "I have an appointment this afternoon," he said, his tone casual. "But if you're up for it, I can drive you to your checkup before I go." Ava glanced up sharply. "My checkup?" He tilted his head slightly. "You're still seeing a doctor, right?" The question made her chest tighten. She had been. Of course. She had never missed an appointment before. But Logan had always handled the scheduling, the payments, the transportation. He had made sure she never had to think about it, until he didn't. And now, she had nothing. No insurance, no credit cards, no way to walk into an office without being turned away. Ava gripped the mug a little tighter, embarrassment gurgling in her stomach.
Hi!
Ethan must have seen something shift in her expression, because his voice softened. "Don't worry about that part. I've got it covered." She blinked at him, startled. "Ethan, I can't." "You can," he interrupted gently. "And you will." There was no pity in his voice, no condescension. Just a quiet certainty, like he had already decided this was non-negotiable. Ava opened her mouth to argue, but what was she going to say? That she didn't need help? That she would figure it out alone? She had no one else. And Ethan, he wasn't asking for anything. Ava swallowed hard, nodding slowly. "Okay." Ethan's shoulders eased slightly, as if he had been expecting a fight and was relieved that she hadn't given him one. "Good," he said simply, pushing off the doorframe. "I'll be ready in an hour." As he disappeared down the hallway, Ava sat there, staring at the steaming tea in her hands. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she wasn't being forced into something. She wasn't being controlled. Someone had just offered and let her choose. And that was something entirely new. Ava sat in the passenger seat of Ethan's truck, staring out at the passing streets, her fingers absently tracing the curve of her belly. The air inside the vehicle was quiet, except for the soft hum of the engine and the occasional tap of Ethan's fingers against the steering wheel. She had expected this to feel strange, being driven to her checkup by someone who, just days ago, had been a complete stranger. But to her surprise, it didn't. There was no tension, no forced small talk, just an easy kind of silence, the kind that didn't demand anything from her. Still, the reality of it settled deep in her chest like a weight she couldn't shake. This should have been Logan. For months, he had gone to these appointments with her, acting like the devoted husband, nodding along as the doctors explained things she didn't quite understand. But looking back, Ava realized that Logan had never really been present. He had never asked how she felt after the appointments, never reached for her hand when she was nervous. He had just been there, an accessory to the image of a perfect husband. And now he wasn't here at all. Ethan pulled into the parking lot of the clinic and shifted the truck into park. He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "You okay?" Ava forced a small nod. "Yeah." She wasn't sure if he believed her, but he didn't push. Inside, the clinic smelled like antiseptic and paper. The receptionist barely glanced up as Ava checked in, her fingers tightening around the clipboard as she filled out the form. Under emergency contact, she hesitated. For the first time, she didn't write Logan's name. She left it blank. A nurse called her name, leading her into the exam room. Ethan stayed in the waiting area, and for some reason, that made her stomach twist. Not because she needed him in there with her, but because the idea of stepping into this moment alone again was unexpectedly hard. The checkup was routine. blood pressure, weight, measurements. The doctor, an older woman with a kind smile, moved the wand over her belly, and within seconds, the sound of her baby's heartbeat filled the room. Strong, steady, real. A lump rose in Ava's throat. No matter how many times she heard that sound, it always made her breath hitch. You're almost there. She should have been excited, but instead, all she felt was uncertainty. By the time she stepped back into the waiting room, Ethan was standing near the window, hands in his pockets. When he spotted her, he straightened slightly. "Everything okay?" Ava nodded. "Yeah, baby's fine." Something in his shoulders eased. He didn't say much as they walked back to the truck, but once they were on the road, he finally spoke. "You were quiet in there." Ava let out a breath, staring down at her hands. Ethan nodded as if he understood. Maybe he did. A few moments passed before he said, "You're not staying here forever, you know." Ava blinked, startled. "What?" He glanced at her, lips twitching in something that wasn't quite a smile. "At my place. I know you probably feel like this is just another thing you're stuck in. But it's not. You'll figure things out. Ava, you'll find your own way." Her throat tightened. "And if I don't?" Ethan's fingers tightened around the wheel. "You will." There was something about the way he said it, no hesitation, no doubt, that made her want to believe him. For so long, her life had been dictated by what Logan wanted. But now, for the first time, she was being asked what she wanted. And maybe, just maybe, she was ready to find out. Logan Sinclair had always believed he was untouchable. For years, he had built his empire on a foundation of charm, power, and carefully cultivated relationships. He knew how to play the game, how to manipulate people, how to always stay one step ahead. He had crafted an image of himself as the golden boy of the business world, a man who had it all. And for a while, he really had believed that. Sitting on a private beach, drink in hand, with Madison curled up beside him, Logan barely thought about Ava. The inconvenience of dropping her off at that gas station had already faded into the background. She had been holding him back, anchoring him to a life he no longer wanted. This was freedom. Or at least, that's what he told himself. Until the world turned on him. It started with a single post, a grainy security camera video from that gas station. At first, Logan had barely paid attention. Who cared about some random footage from a rundown rest stop? But then, he saw it. Ava, 8 months pregnant, stepping out of his car. And then, moments later, that car pulling away, leaving her standing alone in the rain, confused, abandoned. The video spread like wildfire. At first, the outrage came from small accounts, people throwing words like heartless and monster around. But then the bigger voices got involved. Bloggers, journalists, influencers. People started digging.
It wasn't just about the gas station anymore.
Someone uncovered the beach resort photos, the ones of Logan and Madison sipping champagne while Ava was stranded. Then came the stories. Former employees, business rivals, even distant acquaintances, all suddenly eager to expose who Logan Sinclair really was. By the end of the day, justice for Ava was trending worldwide. And that was only the beginning. Investors panicked. Partners distanced themselves. Clients started pulling out, not wanting to be associated with a man whose name was now synonymous with betrayal. At first, Logan brushed it off. Social media, outrage, never lasted. But this time, they didn't. His company's board of directors called an emergency meeting. Lawyers advised him to make a statement, to apologize. Even his PR team. the people he paid to clean up his messes, looked nervous. But Logan? Logan refused to beg. He would not be destroyed over a woman who should have been grateful for the life he had given her. Still, no matter how much he tried to convince himself, things were crumbling faster than he could control. And then came the final blow. Madison was gone. She didn't leave dramatically. There was no fight, no screaming match. Just an empty closet, a drained credit card, and a simple note left on the nightstand. Oops, looks like you lost everything. Have fun cleaning up your mess. For the first time in his life, Logan Sinclair was alone. And the worst part, no one cared. The knock on the door came late in the evening, a sharp, hollow sound that sent a chill down Ava's spine. She had just finished putting away the last of the baby clothes Ethan had helped her pick out, folding the tiny onesies with a care that made her chest tighten. Her belly was rounder now, her due date looming closer than ever. But for the first time in months, she wasn't afraid of what was coming. At least, not until now. Something about the knock felt wrong. Ethan wasn't supposed to be back for another hour, and no one else ever came by unannounced. The house was tucked away on the quieter side of town, a place where visitors were rare and interruptions even rarer. Ava hesitated, her fingers curled into the fabric of the onesie still in her hands. Then, slowly, she moved toward the door. Another knock, louder this time. Her pulse quickened. She swallowed hard, bracing herself, and pulled the door open. Logan. Logan. For a moment, she simply stared, unable to process that he was really here. Standing on Ethan's porch, in the soft glow of the porch light, looking nothing like the man she remembered. His suit, once meticulously tailored, was wrinkled, like he had been wearing it for days. Dark stubble shadowed his jaw, his hair slightly disheveled, and for the first time ever, there was no arrogance in his posture. Just desperation. Ava, he breathed, his voice rough, almost pleading. Her stomach twisted. She gripped the edge of the door, resisting the overwhelming urge to slam it shut in his face. But Logan took that moment of hesitation as an invitation. He stepped forward, his eyes scanning her face, then dropping to her belly. For a flicker of a second, something unreadable passed over his features. But Ava didn't care. She didn't care what he felt. She lifted her chin, her voice cold and steady. "Why are you here, Logan?" He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his disheveled hair. A bitter laugh bubbled up in Ava's throat before she could stop it. "A mistake," she echoed. His jaw tightened. "I should have never left." "Should have?" The words hit her like a slap. They weren't an apology. They weren't even remorse. They were regret, but not the kind she had once desperately wished for. No, Logan wasn't here because he realized he loved her. He was here because he had nowhere else to go. Ava took a slow step back, gripping the doorframe to keep herself steady. "And yet you did." Logan flinched, but he recovered quickly, his hands clenching at his sides.
I was simping.
"Straight, Ava. I was stupid. I was selfish." His voice wavered slightly. "I don't know what got into me." She tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "Oh, I do." Logan blinked, thrown off. "What?" Ava stepped forward slightly, her voice like ice. "You thought I was weak." He opened his mouth. She didn't let him speak. "You thought I had nowhere to go, that I would fall apart without you, that I'd come crawling back, begging you to take me in." Logan swallowed hard. He didn't deny it. He couldn't. Ava's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "But guess what, Logan?" She placed a hand on her belly, her voice steady. "I survived." Logan's eyes flickered down to her stomach again, like he was only now really seeing her. For the first time since she had opened the door, he looked unsure. His throat bobbed. Ava, please. I lost everything. Madison, she left me. My company's gone. My reputation. Her stomach twisted, not with sadness, not with longing, but with disgust. That's why he was here. Not because he had realized his mistake, not because he wanted to make things right, but because he had no one else. Ava let out a slow, measured breath, then met his gaze head on. You're not sorry you left me, she said quietly. You're sorry that I moved on without you. Logan opened his mouth, then closed it, because they both knew she was right. Ava took a step back, her fingers tightening around the door handle. You don't get to come back now, Logan. His face twisted, desperation flashing across his features. Ava. She didn't let him finish. With one last glance, the kind that didn't hold hate, didn't hold anger, but something worse. Indifference. She simply said, I don't need you anymore. And then she closed the door in his face. For the first time, it was Logan Sinclair who was left standing in the cold. Ava barely had time to let the weight of slamming that door sink in before the first sharp pain ripped through her abdomen. She gasped, one hand flying to her belly, the other bracing against the doorframe. Her breath came in short, shallow bursts as the pain tightened around her, stronger than before, sharper. It wasn't like the Braxton Hicks contractions she had experienced in the past. This was different. This was real. For a moment, she stood frozen, her pulse roaring in her ears, trying to convince herself that it was just the stress of seeing Logan. But then another contraction hit, harder this time, stealing the air from her lungs. No, 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 not now. Panic clawed at her chest. She wasn't ready. The baby wasn't due for another 2 weeks. Ethan wasn't home. She was alone. Another contraction sent her stumbling back against the wall, her knees buckling. She reached for her phone, her fingers fumbling as she unlocked it, scrolling down to the only person she knew would answer. The call barely rang twice before Ethan's voice came through, steady and calm. Ava? She sucked in a shaky breath. I think it's happening. There was a beat of silence. Then his voice sharpened. Where are you? At the house. A cry slipped from her lips as another wave of pain tore through her. Ethan, I can't do this alone. You're not alone. His voice was firm, unwavering. I'm on my way. Just hold on, Ava. She barely registered the call disconnecting. Time blurred into a cycle of pain and shallow breathing, her body trembling, as she tried to stay upright. The minutes felt like hours. Each contraction hit harder, leaving her breathless, her vision swimming. And then, suddenly, the sound of tires screeching into the driveway. A door slamming, footsteps pounding up the porch. Then Ethan was there. The moment he saw her, his expression shifted from concern to urgency. Ava. She let out a breath, relief washing over her, even as another contraction made her knees buckle. Ethan was there before she could fall, his strong arms steadying her, his warmth grounding her. I've got you, he murmured, his voice a tether in the storm. She barely processed being lifted off her feet, her head pressing against his chest as he carried her to the truck. The world outside blurred as the pain overtook everything else, each contraction stealing more of her strength. Breathe, Ava, Ethan said as he started the engine. Just keep breathing. She tried. God, she tried. but everything hurt. The drive to the hospital was a haze of flashing lights and Ethan's voice keeping her anchored. He didn't panic, not once. He kept one hand on the wheel, the other reaching for her whenever she gasped for breath. "You're doing great," he told her, his voice steady. "Sure, we're almost there." By the time they pulled up to the emergency entrance, Ava was barely holding on. Ethan didn't waste a second. He threw the door open, scooped her into his arms, and rushed through the sliding glass doors. A nurse hurried toward them. "She's in labor. Get a doctor now," Ethan barked. Everything after that was a blur of movement and voices. Nurses surrounded her, placing her on a gurney, wheeling her down a hallway lit with harsh fluorescent lights. Someone pressed a cool cloth to her forehead. Another voice asked her questions, but she could barely process the words. All she knew was pain. Then, suddenly, Ethan's hand was in hers. She didn't know how or when he had made it to her bedside, but he was there, his fingers wrapping around hers, strong and real. "I'm right here," he murmured. "I'm not going anywhere." And somehow, that was enough to keep her from breaking. Hours passed in a blur of pain and exhaustion. Ava felt like she was floating in and out of reality, her body racked with effort. But through it all, Ethan never left. He never let go. And then, a sharp cry filled the room. Ava's entire world stopped. Tears blurred her vision as she gasped, her chest heaving. The room around her faded into the background, the voices of the nurses, the beeping of the monitors. None of it mattered, because they were placing her baby in her arms. Tiny, perfect, warm. A sob tore from her lips as she looked down at the wrinkled little face, the small hands curled into fists. She traced her fingers over the soft skin, her heart pounding, her breath catching. Her son, her son. "We did it, baby," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We made it." Across the room, Ethan exhaled a shaky breath, running a hand through his hair, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he stepped closer, his gaze locked on her and the baby. Ava swallowed hard. Do you want to hold him?" Ethan hesitated, his eyes widening slightly, as if the thought hadn't even occurred to him. But when she carefully held the baby out, he didn't refuse. Gently, almost reverently, he took the small bundle into his arms. Ava had never seen Ethan look shaken before, but in that moment, he did. He stared down at the baby, his throat bobbing as he swallowed. The weight of it, the reality of it, seemed to settle over him, all at once. "He's beautiful," he murmured. Ava's chest tightened. She had never expected this, never expected Ethan to be here, to be this. She had braced herself to do it all alone. But she wasn't alone. Not anymore. The hospital room was quiet except for the soft beeping of the monitors and the faint rustling of fabric as Ava adjusted her hold on her newborn son. The weight of him against her chest was both grounding and surreal, a reminder that despite everything, she had made it. She ran a fingertip gently over his tiny hand, marveling at how small he was, how fragile, but at the same time, so incredibly real. He was hers, a part of her. For so long, she had been defined by Logan, by his choices, by his betrayal, by the void he left behind. But sitting here, in this dimly lit hospital room, her son nestled safely in her arms, she realized something. Logan wasn't her ending. He was nothing more than a chapter in a story that was still being written. She inhaled deeply, closing her eyes for a moment. Exhaustion tugged at her limbs, but sleep felt impossible. There was too much to feel, too much to process. Across the room, Ethan stood near the window, his hands resting in his pockets as he gazed outside. The glow of the streetlights cast shadows over his face, making his expression unreadable. But there was something in his stance, something unsettled. Ava watched him for a long moment before finally breaking the silence. "You don't have to stay, you know." Ethan turned slightly, his brows pulling together as if the thought hadn't even occurred to him. She cleared her throat, shifting slightly in bed. "You've done more than enough, Ethan. You don't owe me anything." The moment the words left her mouth, she regretted them. Because the way Ethan's jaw tensed, the way his hands curled slightly into fists at his sides, she realized that wasn't what she had meant. Not really. His gaze flickered to the baby, then back to her. His voice was quieter when he finally spoke. "You think that's why I stayed?" "Because I felt like I had to." Ava's stomach twisted. "I don't know." Because, truthfully, she didn't. She had spent years being with someone who only did things for her out of obligation, out of appearances. She didn't know what it meant for someone to choose her, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Ethan exhaled sharply, dragging a hand through his hair. He was silent for a moment, as if trying to find the right words. Then he turned fully toward her, stepping closer. "Ava." His voice was steady, but there was something raw beneath it. "I didn't stop for you that night because I felt obligated. I didn't bring you here, take care of you, sit by your side because I thought I had to." His eyes met hers, and suddenly she couldn't look away. "I did it because I wanted to." Ava's breath caught in her throat. "I care about you," Ethan continued, his voice softer now, more careful, more than I ever expected to. Her heart pounded. She felt like the air had been sucked from the room. For so long, she had convinced herself that love, the kind that wasn't transactional, that wasn't selfish, wasn't for her. And yet, here was this man, this good man, standing in front of her, saying things she never thought she would hear. She swallowed hard, her fingers tightening slightly around the soft blanket wrapped around her baby. He shook his head, stepping back slightly, as if giving her space. "You don't have to say anything now. I just needed you to know." Ava exhaled, her pulse still racing. He wasn't asking for anything. He wasn't pushing her. He was just offering. And maybe that was what scared her the most. She had spent her entire life being told what she needed, what she should want. Logan had made decisions for her, shaped her world in a way that left no room for her own choices. But Ethan was letting her decide. She looked down at her son, at the tiny life she had fought so hard to protect, and for the first time, she felt something unfamiliar stir in her chest. Hope, hope. She glanced back up at Ethan, meeting his gaze once more. And then, quietly, hesitantly, she reached out, her fingers brushing against his. It was small, barely more than a touch. But it was something. And for now, that was enough. The days after the hospital blurred together in a way that felt both exhausting and surreal. Ava was learning what it meant to start over. And this time, she was doing it on her own terms. She had expected to feel lost. She had expected to feel alone. But she wasn't. Ethan was still there, not hovering, not pushing, but present. He drove her and the baby home from the hospital with the same steady ease he had shown her since the night he found her in the rain. He carried the car seat inside without a word, adjusting the straps with the kind of care that made something tighten in her chest. And when she stood in the doorway, looking around the space that had become more of a home than the mansion she had once lived in, she realized something. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. The baby stirred in her arms, his tiny fingers curling against the fabric of her sweater, and Ava felt the weight of everything, every pain, every loss, every betrayal, begin to shift. She had made it through the storm, and she was still standing. Across town, Logan Sinclair was learning what it felt like to fall. His world had collapsed around him, and no matter how hard he tried, no matter how many desperate calls he made, no one was answering. His name, once powerful, once respected, was now nothing more than a stain on the business world. His company was gone, stripped from him by the very board members who had once worshipped him. His money vanished. The legal fees alone were bleeding him dry, and the sponsorships, the partnerships, everything he had built, had crumbled beneath the weight of his own choices. And Madison? She had left the moment things got bad, slipping away like smoke, not even bothering to fake regret. He had found her note, short and taunting, mocking him for being so arrogant to think she would stay. For the first time in his life, Logan had nothing. And, worst of all, the one person who might have still cared, who might have still given him a chance, had slammed the door in his face. Logan sat in his hotel room, staring at the television screen. He hadn't turned it on, hadn't even noticed what was playing. His mind kept going back to the last time he saw Ava. The way she had stood tall. The way she had looked at him, not with hate, not with anger, but with something so much worse. Indifference. She had moved on. And that was a punishment far worse than any financial ruin. Ava barely thought about Logan anymore. She had better things to focus on. Her baby, her future. The small business she had started designing custom baby clothes, something that combined her love for fashion with her new reality as a mother. She had thrown herself into building something of her own. Something no one could ever take away from her again. And Ethan? He was still there. Not because he had to be, not because she was helpless, but because he chose to be. One evening, as they sat on the back porch watching the sunset, Ava turned to him, her heart pounding for reasons she didn't fully understand yet. "Ethan," she murmured. He looked at her, setting down his cup of tea.
Yeah?
She hesitated, then smiled softly. "Thank you. For everything." Ethan held her gaze, his expression unreadable for a moment before he said, "You don't have to thank me, Ava." She shook her head. "I do. Because for the first time in my life, I don't feel like I'm just surviving." She exhaled, her chest feeling lighter than it had in years. "I feel like I'm actually living." Ethan studied her for a long moment, then reached for her hand, squeezing it lightly. "That's all I ever wanted for you." And in that moment, she knew she wasn't just someone's wife anymore. She wasn't just a woman who had been left behind. She was strong, independent, loved. She was herself. And for the first time in a long, long time, she was free. The lesson. Ava's journey is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. She was abandoned, betrayed, and left with nothing, but she refused to be defined by the pain others inflicted on her. Instead, she found strength in herself, built a life on her own terms, and discovered that true love isn't about possession or control. It's about choice. This story teaches us that walking away from the past isn't weakness. It's power. Sometimes, the people who hurt us expect us to stay broken, to keep chasing them, to believe that we can't survive without them. But the truth, we can. Ava didn't need revenge to win. She didn't have to destroy Logan. He did that himself. She simply chose to move forward instead of looking back. And that's the greatest lesson of all. Your past does not define you. Your pain does not own you. You are stronger than you think. So if you've ever been in a situation where someone underestimated you, where someone walked away believing you wouldn't make it, prove them wrong. Not with anger, not with anger, not with hatred, but by thriving, by choosing yourself, by building a life so good, so full, that the people who left you behind become nothing more than a distant memory. Because happiness isn't something we wait for. It's something we create. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories.